Welcome back. Well, Castro stepping down has prompted comments in the U.S. from President Bush and the presidential hopefuls.
This transition ought to lead to free and fair elections, and I mean free and I mean fair. Not these kind of staged elections that the Castro brothers try to foist off as being true democracy.
President who will work with countries around the world, in Europe, in the Western Hemisphere, to push Cuba now to join the community of nations and to become a democracy.
Absolutely confident that the transition to a free and open democracy is being made before we provide that additional aid and assistance.
But Barack Obama released the following statement: "The end of a dark era in Cuba's history, an essential first step, but sadly insufficient in bringing freedom to Cuba." Joining us again are our guests in San Francisco, filmmaker Solando. In Washington, D.C., Frank Calzone. He is the Executive Director of the Center for a Free Cuba. And in London, Abdul Wahab Al-Afandi, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Westminster. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. We're talking about the Fidel Castro's decision to step down and how the international community is responding to that. Mr. Solando, the Americans don't seem to be at the moment enthusiastic about the decision to step down. Is this something that means that Washington will maintain the same traditional position towards Cuba?
Well, for the rest of the Bush administration, I think we can predict that there will be no or very little change. The point is this, that if you really want to see change in Cuba, you want to lift the embargo and lift the travel ban. The quickest way to reduce the Cuban government's control over its economy and indeed introduce widespread discussion is to allow Americans to freely travel to Cuba and allow Americans to do business there. Cuba would change in a matter of weeks. The fact is, the Bush government doesn't want to change Cuba. It says it does, but all of its actions are to the contrary. For years, we have seen legislation punishing Fidel Castro, and that's the word that's been used. And for all the years I've known him, I don't think I've ever seen him miss a meal or a conjugal opportunity as a result of any of these so-called punishing measures. So I can conclude that the United States government is essentially enslaved to a small group of extremely right-wing Cubans who also don't want to see any change in Cuba. They maintain the embargo as the center, the pillar of their ideology, through which they exercise control and collect lots of money from the United States government for TV Marti, a television program that's beamed to Cuba that nobody sees, for Radio Marti that's totally irrelevant.
Mr. Frank, you've heard what Mr. Lando has been saying. Basically, the Cuban community is to be held responsible for standing against any rapprochement between the Americans and the Cubans.
Hello, are you asking me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your statement, but the Cuban community does not control U.S. policy toward Cuba. U.S. policy toward Cuba is predicated on American interests. The Cuban government, since before Mr. Clinton was in the White House, has been listed as a supporter of international terrorism. That's part of the problem. The President of the United States has repeatedly said that Cuba's problems will not be resolved in Washington or in Madrid or in San Francisco, but in Havana, that the Cuban people have to have the right to decide their own destiny. That's the way it should be. The European Union, for example, has moved closer and closer to a similar position. When Cuba wanted to enter the Cotonou Agreement, a tariff agreement that is very beneficial to developing countries, the European Union said to the Cuban government, you must comply with labor standards. You must obey some human rights regulations. The Cuban government said no, and Cuba was not allowed to enter the Cotonou Agreement. America's Watch, Human Rights Watch, just put out a report about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, saying that the European Union wanted to start negotiations to normalize relations with Havana.
But human rights
this is not the Bush administration.
Exactly. Human rights
this is not the Bush.
Let me ask Mr.
This is not
Mr. Frank. I'll go back to you, but let me ask Mr. Abdul Wahab Al Afendi. Human rights is definitely an issue, but the Europeans throughout the last few years have been trying to distance themselves from the American position. Do you think now that by the new decision to change and to in Cuba, the Europeans could help bridge the gap between the Americans and the Cubans?
I think first, before we get to that, let's look at we're speaking about Castro's legacy. And I think anti-Americanism, which has started Castro and catapulted him to power, because people in Cuba were upset by the way the United States was dominating their country and trying to rob it in collusion with dictators, has sustained Castro throughout his career, and now is again resurgent in South America. And I think that's a lesson to the United States in a time when they're having similar problem in the Middle East and elsewhere, talking about winning hearts and minds, to understand the depth of the problem they face in Latin America and in Cuba. I think the people of Cuba who support Castro maybe did that more less because they like communism and more because they dislike America.
Okay.
Now, coming to the European Union, I think, yes, always the problem with the embargo, which has been imposed by the United States, is that has not been followed by everybody else. The Europeans, the Canadians, everybody else was
So you're not expecting any
embargo.
change in the European position?
I think the European position is going to change much quicker than the American position.
Okay, very good. Let me go to Mr. I have some few questions for you guys. I'll start by Mr. Lando in San Francisco. What will change with Obama or Clinton as president of the United States of America?
I think if a Democratic president wins in 2008, the first thing that will be dropped is the restrictions on Cuban family travel. President Bush instituted draconian restrictions on the rights of Cuban Americans to travel and see their families once every 3 years, and he even narrowed what means relative.
Well, let me go to Mr. Frank Calson in Washington, D.C. Mr. Calson, with McCain as a president of the United States of America, is this something that would say that the Americans will maintain the same hawkish stance towards Cuba?
I wouldn't call it hawkish. I think I'd call it practical. The policy of the United States under any president will not change until there's change in Cuba. If the Cuban government continues to support international terrorism, there will not be change in Washington. If the Cuban government continues its support for violent groups and its alliance with Mr. Chavez and others, there's not going to be change in Washington. The idea that the Cubans are anti-American flies in the face of evidence. There are 2 million Cuban Americans here. The Cubans are not, the Americans, they go to Cuba, and Mr. Landau could tell you that, are very popular in Cuba.
Mr. Frank,
this is not.
In less
yes,
than 30,
hello, do you hear me?
Yeah, exactly. In less than 30 seconds, Mr. Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, Castro's cry, socialism or death, has become a catchphrase. Does it have the same resonance in the world as it used to have during the last 5 decades?
No, I think it's already, I think even Cuba itself now, socialism has gone away. And I think that Cuba has already changed. I think the position of the United States, which Mr. Frank has been expressing, looks at an outdated Cuba. I mean, Cuba is not as militant as it was. Yes, in the 1980s and 70s, it worked against America in Africa and actually won that war, that Cold War against America there. But I think the Cubans are now much more, they are not engaged. I don't think
Mr. Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, I apologize. We have to leave it right there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Frank Calson in Washington, D.C., Mr. Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi in London, and Solando, who has been with us from San Francisco. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.